In this video, I'm going to explain exactly what is MIDI. Now, for those of you who have been musicians for many years, and those of you who are very seasoned and who have been around and doing music for many decades, this information is going to be very basic, and I'm sure people in that category know this information inside and out. This video is intended for beginners, people who are just starting to do electronic music and who maybe aren't totally certain exactly what does MIDI mean. That's what I'm going to try to describe in this video. So, MIDI, what is MIDI? Basically, MIDI is an acronym for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It was introduced in the early 80s, and it pretty much stayed the exact same for many, many years. They came out with General MIDI in 1991, and that was designed to adapt to a lot of the technology that was changing at that time, such as the new technology like USB and FireWire. And basically that stayed the same all the way up to 2020 when they introduced MIDI 2.0. But in general, MIDI today is still basically the same as it was in 1983. Basically, MIDI is often referred to as a communications protocol, which is just a fancy way of saying that it enables musical instruments to connect to each other and send information to and from each other. Basically, MIDI allows gear and equipment and instruments to talk to each other and link to each other and communicate. You basically have a standard MIDI cable, and MIDI cables come in all different lengths. They go usually from 3 feet all the way up to 20 feet. They're available in a variety of lengths, and these cables are often referred to as 5-pin DIN because when you look inside, there are basically 5 pins in the connection. And these cables can carry up to 16 channels of information. Now, just to give a little bit of history of MIDI, MIDI was standardized in 1983. The famous Robert Moog, who invented the Moog synthesizer, announced MIDI in the October 1982 issue of Keyboard. The first instruments that ever had MIDI were the Roland Jupiter 6 and the Prophet 600. And in 1983, the first drum machine came along with MIDI, the Roland TR-909. And the first sequencer to offer MIDI was the Roland MSQ 700. What are some of the uses of MIDI? Okay, well, there are a ton of uses, but some of the main ones, and some of the ones that I've certainly used MIDI for over the years, you can connect your instruments to a sequencer. So basically, you can program the sequencer, tell it what you want the instruments to play, and the sequencer through MIDI will tell the instrument or instruments exactly what to play. And you can interface with more than one keyboard. You can basically connect 3, 4, 5, up to 16 different instruments all together, and sometimes even more through MIDI. And they can communicate with each other, and they can follow the commands given by the sequencer. Basically, you can also use it for doubling, and I used to do this a lot in my early days. What that means is I can connect one keyboard to another keyboard, and I can play one keyboard, but it will produce 2 sounds, because through the MIDI connection, I'm able to play one keyboard, but the sounds are coming from 2 different instruments through the MIDI connection. It's also a way of interfacing a controller keyboard to a sound module. Basically, what that means is there are keyboards, controller keyboards or master keyboards that do not make a sound at all, but through MIDI you can connect them to an outboard module, and you can tap into all the hundreds of sounds that may be available in that module. So it's a great way for broadening your palette and connecting to a bunch of different modules that offer you a bunch of different sounds. Basically, another huge thing that MIDI enabled musicians to do is to connect to their computer, and that was revolutionary. All of a sudden you had musicians composing on their computer. Home musicians with home studios were able to use their computer to interface and control 1, 2, or 3 or even more drum machines and synthesizers. So the fact that you were able through MIDI to connect your instruments to a computer was revolutionary. I remember my first experience with MIDI. I bought my first synthesizer actually in 1994. I bought a Korg Poly 800 used, and I was able to connect through MIDI my Poly 800 to my Boss drum machine. And the Poly 800 has a built-in sequencer, so I was able to program in a very simple bass line, like a 2-bar bass line, and I was able to synchronize that in perfect sync with the drum machine. And the first time I heard that, it blew me away. All of a sudden, a whole new world had opened up for me as a musician. It goes without saying, and this can't be stressed enough, prior to MIDI, instruments from different manufacturers could not communicate with each other. So if you had a Korg synthesizer or a Boss drum machine or a Roland product, they couldn't communicate with each other before MIDI. After MIDI, they could. It was the standardized method of communication and connection that enabled all these instruments to all of a sudden connect with each other and work together, and it just broadened the palette of so many musicians very, very widely. Now, old gear can be retrofitted. You may be wondering, well, if I have an old synthesizer from the 70s, can I install MIDI? Some people do. Now, this opens up a huge debate. Many people think this is great. A lot of people are very opposed to it. A lot of people feel that installing MIDI into a classic analog synthesizer is just wrong and it shouldn't be done. That's totally your opinion. I don't really see the problem with it, but some people, I guess analog purists, feel that retrofitting MIDI into an old synthesizer is just plain wrong. But you're entitled to your own opinion on that. Now, there's a lot of modern keyboards that have MIDI, but the only output is through USB. That is, they don't have a standard MIDI out port. It's just a USB port. And you may be wondering, how do I connect that new USB MIDI connection to an old instrument with the standardized port? There is a company in England called Kenton, which makes adapters, so you are able to connect your new keyboard with USB MIDI to an old instrument that may have standardized MIDI connection. And I've never owned one of these adapters, but I've heard good things about them. Again, the name of that company is Kenton, that makes those adapters. When you compose a song with MIDI, you save it as a MIDI file. And it's very, very important to understand a MIDI file is not an audio recording. It is a set of instructions like pitch and tempo, etc. Basically, multiple sounds can be used. If I have a MIDI file, for example, I can assign MIDI information to it, but that information can be changed later. For example, let's say I program a melody on my sequencer. In the beginning, I think, that melody would sound good with a saxophone sound. So I assign that MIDI information that I programmed to a saxophone sound. But after I listen to it a few times, I start to think, I'm not too happy with that saxophone. I want to change that to a piano sound. It's extremely easy to do that. And that's one of the beauties of MIDI, is that it allows so much flexibility and creativity. I can very easily switch from that original saxophone sound and assign that MIDI information that I programmed to a piano sound or a bass sound or an organ sound, any sound at all. It's really, really expressive and very flexible as to what I can do. MIDI's impact has been enormous. It just goes without saying the enormous impact and influence and how much change that MIDI has enacted over the last 40 years. It's basically been a complete game changer. If you are just discovering MIDI for the first time, enjoy it. You're going to love it. And it can be just as simple or just as complicated as you want it to be. You can really dive into it and you can really get into the complexities of MIDI. Or again, if you just want to use it to synchronize a simple 2-bar bass line, like I mentioned before, with your drum machine, you can use it that way as well. So that's my overview of MIDI. Thank you for watching. I hope you can join us again next time. I post new tech videos all the time, so please sign up to my channel. You'll see a subscribe button in the bottom right corner, a red subscribe button. Please click on that and please join the channel. That way you'll be up to date on all the latest tech reviews. Please give us a thumbs up, leave a comment. It's always appreciated. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.